Hey guys, Stick Figure Historian here. Welcome to another episode of the Scotland series. Last time we talked about the crowning of John Balliol, and how that was all a joke, since it was King Edward who had chosen him, and he was still basically running Scotland. And then, when Balliol tried to fight back at the Battle of Dunbar, the Scots charged too soon, the army fell apart, and a bunch of people, including himself later, were captured, and yeah, disaster. Edward nabbed a bunch of the historical records and took away their main symbol of kingly authority. Game over. Or not. Among those nobles and knights that were captured at the Battle of Dunbar in 1296 was the Lord of Petty, Sir Andrew Moray. His misfortune had been double that of other men, for his son, also named Andrew, had also been captured fighting on the field beside him. Thus, both father and son, lord and heir, were trapped in the clutches of King Edward. The elder Andrew was locked safely away in the Tower of London, but the younger Andrew was imprisoned instead within Chester Castle. He was considered of less importance, and so, to save valuable space within the closely guarded tower, he was sent there instead. That was a decision the English would soon greatly regret. For young Andrew was not the kind to sit and wring his hands over his fate. Right away, he began to look for a way to escape. That very winter, he found it. Guys, I don't think they had light bulbs back then. Okay, that's better. And with the escape of that single man, began King Edward's first greatest difficulty in keeping his grip on Scotland. Andrew fled north over the border, all the way back to his father's lands in the province of Moray. Which, the province of Moray back in those times was a little different than it is today. Here's a medieval map. The pink border shows the province, and the green border shows the bishopric, which doesn't really mean anything politically. That's just the way the church divided up the land for bishops and whatnot. And the dotted line, which is kind of hard to make out, shows the earldom. It's kind of complicated, but basically we're just focused on the pink line, which is a province. Andrew's father didn't own all of this, but he was a minor lord of Petty, which lies within the province. Andrew found the poor tenants in a sorry case. The rule of their new English overlords was no light burden. Hugh de Cressingham was the newly appointed treasurer of Scotland, and he and his tax collectors rode throughout the land, charging people more taxes than they truly owed, and then promptly pocketing the extra money, thus growing rich themselves off oppression. And not only this, but King Edward also sought to take the Scottish fighting men away to France, forcing them to fight in his bloody war. There was no lord to stand up and fight for his people. There was not even a castle to run to for protection, for nearly every one of them had been confiscated by English lords or traitor Scots. Young Andrew saw that his people needed a leader to help them against the foe. They needed their lord to rise up and protect them. And if his father couldn't be there to lead them, then it was up to him to take the sword in his father's place. Andrew raised his banner at his father's castle, Avok, and called all who would to follow him to fight for the right of King Balliol. His call was quickly answered. Several small parties of English knights and nobles traveling around Moray were ambushed and killed, and the English tax collectors were resisted. The Scots fought back in whatever little ways that they could. They would strike hard, then disappear into the forests and bogs where their enemy couldn't find them. And Andrew was not alone in this fight for his king. The chief of Clan Rory, too, had begun a rebellion in the land of Argyll. In Fife, the Earl Macduff and his sons also drew the sword against the English usurpers. If you were to look at these places on a map, then you would see that between Moray, Argyll, and Fife, resistance was coming from every direction in Scotland, except in the very south. And it wasn't long before a leader there too arose. The story of William Wallace is just one example of how this war turned the lives of many people upside down. He didn't seem a man destined to come to fame when he was born. After all, he was only the second son of a minor knight in Elderslie. He was about 16 years old when King Edward crossed the River Tweed. His father, Sir Malcolm, was slain resisting the invading hordes. And from that day forth, a hatred was born in Wallace's heart against the English. There are many tales of the younger years of Wallace's life, but no one is quite sure whether they are true or not. They are simply legends. But for the sake of story, I'll share a few of them with you. The very first story of Wallace tells how he first began to fight against the English. He was walking through the town of Ayr one day when the son of the English sheriff there, Selby by name, spoke very rudely to him. Selby made fun of his clothes and demanded that he would hand over his knife to him. Wallace was so angry that he drew his knife instead and killed the man. That is the first Englishman that he is said to have slain. Another story tells how Wallace had gone fishing one day. As he sat busily catching fish, 5 English soldiers passed on the road nearby. When they saw all the fish he had caught, they stopped and demanded that he would give them some. Of course, they didn't just ask for 1 or 2. Rather, they wanted the whole basket full. Wallace tried to reason with them. He said they could have half of his fish. But the soldiers wouldn't hear of it. They said they would have all of the fish and began to try to take his basket away. Wallace had no sword or weapon. All he had was his fishing net. But he didn't let that stop him from fighting back. The pole of the fishing net was sturdy, and the stories tell us that he was a very strong man. He struck out at one of the soldiers with the pole, so hard that he knocked the sword from his hand. He snatched up the sword and began to fight them. 3 of the soldiers were wounded, and 1 was killed, before the last 2 ran off in terror. They hurried to tell their commander, Henry Percy, what had happened. But the English commander was so impressed with the bravery of the young Scotsman that he only laughed at his soldiers and told them they were cowards. In another tale, Wallace found himself in another brawl with the English soldiers within Ayr. He started such a rabble that the whole garrison was called out after him. He tried to fight his way out and escape, but there were too many soldiers this time, and they soon captured him. Henry Percy, who was actually the governor of Ard, was gone at that time. So Wallace was thrown into a dungeon until the man should return and decide what to do with him. For many days, Wallace lay in that terrible place. The conditions were so awful and the food was so poor that eventually he fell ill. His illness grew worse and worse, so that at last, one day when his guards came in, they thought that he was dead. They picked him up and carried him outside the town walls. But as they passed through the town, a woman saw them. She had been Wallace's nurse when he was a little child, and she had recognized him. She went to the soldiers and threw herself down on her knees, begging for the body of the young man. The soldiers were greatly annoyed, but they were kind of glad not to have to bury him themselves, so they gave him to her. The nurse brought Wallace back to her house and laid him down. But when she began to wash the body, she felt his heart beat. He wasn't dead. It took many weeks, but because of the love and tender care of his nurse, Wallace was soon brought back to health. His family and friends still held a fake funeral to trick the English, though, for even by that time he was well known and feared among the invaders. There are many more such stories that I could tell, many of them as thrilling as the well-loved tales of Robin Hood. And some are more believable than others. Like, I really have a hard time believing the one where he literally pulls a Samson and rips a manor door off its hinges after 20 grown men already tried to open it. Yeah, no, literally, that's one of the stories told about him. But I'll have to save all that for another time. Or another series. Perhaps someday you may read of them on your own. For now, I must return to what I set out to do, which is to tell you how Wallace became such a great leader in the south of Scotland.